Aloha, and welcome to this week's edition of Mauna Kea at Home. My name is Jameeka Marshall, and I'm an outreach assistant at the International Gemini Observatory, which is a program of NSF's NOIRLab. Today, I'm going to discuss the basic parts of a telescope. Now, it's very important to be familiar with the parts of your telescope and their functions before attempting to set up and actually use your telescope. So pictured here is one of my telescopes. This is Bellatrix, and she is an 80 millimeter refracting spotting scope, and she will be our model as we look at the basic parts of a telescope. Let's start with the dust cap or the lens cover. Now, the lens cover protects your optics from the elements, wind, rain, snow, but also dust, sand, dirt, and bugs, as well as detritus from leaves as well too. So all of these things can have an adverse effect on your optics if they get in there. So keeping your lens cover or the dust cap on your telescope is very important and strongly suggested. Next is the optical tube. Now, this is basically the telescope. The optical tube houses the lenses and mirrors that are used to collect the light, allows us to see these amazing objects. Now, the finder scope, although not an actual part of the telescope, finder scopes are typically included with telescopes because they are, I think, an essential tool for anyone trying to enjoy the night sky. So a finder scope is typically a small auxiliary telescope that's mounted on top of the main telescope, but along the line of sight. Now, in this image, I have my TELRAD, which is a type of finder scope that instead of using crosshairs, it uses these three concentric rings, just like a bullseye, and you want to get your object in the very center of that bullseye. It works the same way with the crosshairs, is you want your object at the center of those crosshairs, and if done properly, then your object should be in the eyepiece. Now, the focuser tube is a movable tube into which either your eyepiece or diagonal, which we'll talk about, or your camera is inserted. Now, this is what you're going to use to see your object. So whatever it is, the eyepiece, camera, whatever, it's going to go into the focuser tube. Now, once that is inserted into your focuser tube, let's say we're using a new CCD camera. Once that CCD camera is inserted into the focuser tube, you're now going to use the focuser knobs to move the objective lens toward or away from the object, which will give us that sharpened view. The eyepiece is very simply the lens that you, the viewer, are going to look through to see the object. Now, there are a different range of eyepieces, and you would choose different eyepieces to look at different objects. We can definitely, hopefully, get into that in a subsequent episode of Mauna Kea at Home. But today, just suffice it to say that, of course, your eyepiece is an essential, basic part of a telescope. Now, the diagonal is not necessarily included with all telescopes, but I do believe strongly that it's a very important basic part of a telescope for two reasons. Now, one is, well, the diagonal is an angled mirror or a prism that allows viewing from a direction that is more or less perpendicular to the usual eyepiece axis. So let's say we are trying to look at this amazing image up high in the sky towards the zenith, right? Which is directly overhead. Well, that means the eyepiece is going to be low on the ground, which can be challenging to get to. In comes the diagonal. The diagonal is going to allow for a more convenient and comfortable viewing angle. Not only that, a diagonal will also re-invert your image. So let's say you're setting up your telescope for the first time and you're checking out your eyepieces and you look at a faraway tree. Well, that tree is going to be inverted, right? The diagonal re-inverts it right side up. So two very important reasons that I've included the diagonal as a basic part of a telescope. The mounting plate is the part of the telescope that's going to hold your objective tube, your telescope tube. It has hinges that allow it to open, right? And so the handles or the latch will close once you place the telescope tube in there. You close the latches over your tube assembly, tighten the wing nuts, and now you have your optical tube mounted to your telescope. Once it's mounted, then you want to go ahead and get your telescope balanced. Now, your counterweight is basically used to balance out the weight of the optical tube and any other accessories that you may have attached to your telescope, like a camera, for example. Now, if the balance is off, or if you don't attempt to balance at all using your counterweights, it can definitely do damage to your optical tube assembly and also to the gear motors of your telescope if you have a go-to scope. So definitely being familiar with your counterweights and the rods, how to get them set up, where your counterweight needs to be placed on the rod is really important. And hopefully we can address that in a subsequent video. But for now, just be familiar with whether or not the telescope that you use will need a counterweight. And if so, make sure you've located the counterweight rod because it could be hidden inside the telescope. The polar scope is another telescope that's actually built into most regular everyday telescopes. Now with my telescope Bellatrix in this first image, it's not altogether straightforward that there's a polar scope right there. But in the second image, you see I've taken off that round cap and you can now see the polar scope. Now inside, you put your eye to the polar scope, what you'll see is some crosshairs and a little spot that indicates where Polaris should be when you have, when this telescope is properly aligned. So a telescope that requires polar alignment where it would be beneficial should also have a polar scope. And this third image simply shows the opening at the front of the telescope where your eye, your line of sight is going to see through from the back to the front out of this opening in the third image to Polaris to hopefully get your polar alignment done correctly. And the last part of a telescope I'm going to go over today is the accessory tray. Now, the accessory tray is a very simple part of the telescope, but really important for making sure you have a good time. So I hate having to go run to the car or someplace else because I forgot to bring my red light or my laser pointer doesn't have batteries or something like that. So the accessory tray is definitely where you should keep everything you're going to use for that night's observing, including your hand paddle if you have a go-to telescope. Having all of your tools on the accessory tray at your fingertips is certainly going to mean that you'll have a lot more time with your telescope, having an enjoyable evening. So I hope you have enjoyed this review of the basic parts of a telescope. I hope you can join us next week on our next edition of Mauna Kea at Home. Mahalo and aloha.